Good morning and welcome, everyone. Jim Brett here at the New England Council, and we're pleased that so many of you could join us for today's program. Well, it's been a very, very busy fall for the New England Council, to say the least, and yet we have several other great events coming up in the next couple of weeks. Next week, Congressman Jim McGovern, the chairman of the Rules Committee, will be our guest at a Capitol Hill report at the Seaport Hotel here in Boston. Our next virtual event will be on November 16th, when Cynthia Hanson of Inbridge will join us for the next installment of our Inside the Corner Office series. And last, but most certainly not least, our 2022 annual celebration is less than 2 weeks away. And we're looking forward to a wonderful evening celebration of our extraordinary New Englanders of the Year. I am told over 210 tables have been sold, 10 at a table. That's over 2,000 New Englanders will be joining us in person at the Omni Hotel in Boston. But today, we have a very special program presented by our Energy and Environment Committee, led by Sean Malone. And as you all know, a few months ago, Congress passed and President Biden signed into law the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. Among other measures, the landmark legislation makes the single largest investment in climate and energy in American history. These tens of millions of dollars would enable the United States to tackle the climate crisis, advance environmental justice, secure our own position as a world leader in clean energy manufacturing, and putting the United States pathway to a net zero economy. These investments will, of course, have tremendous impact here in New England and across the country. We're fortunate to be joined today by some of our region's energy experts to break down what it all means. To lead the discussion, I'm pleased to introduce my good friend, Peter Howe. Many of you know that Peter is a senior advisor at Dolan, a strategic communication firm here in Boston. Prior to joining the team at Dolan, Peter spent many years covering the business community and the energy industry in particular. As a business reporter, the Boston Globe, and New England Cable News. Again, I thank all of you for joining us today. Now I'm pleased to turn it over to Peter.
Jim, thank you very much, and so excited to be seeing you on November 7th at the annual dinner. I also want to thank Emily Heisig and Sean Malone from your staff who've done such a fantastic job organizing this event, and great turnout today. I know, I speak for all of us, we appreciate how much intense desire there is for information and clarification and insight into this really pioneering, really sprawling piece of legislation known as the Inflation Reduction Act. Let me just do a very quick introduction of our panelists today. Beginning with Dan Dolan, who's president of the New England Power Generators Association, where he's been since the fall of 2011. It is a trade association representing more than 90% of all installed generation capacity in New England. If you have electricity today, you can thank Dan's members for that. Sheri Lauten is Director of Government Relations for National Grid Ventures. This is a sister company of the utilities that operates outside of the core regulated businesses in both the US and the UK. Develops, operates, invests in energy projects, technologies, and partnerships to accelerate the development of our clean energy future. Then we have Maggie Lemmerman, head of federal affairs at Ørsted North America. My apologies to the Danes for the pronunciation. Former senior director of federal affairs at the American Wind Energy Association, a former Capitol Hill aide to Congressman Curt Weldon of Pennsylvania, and later Senator John Boozman of Arkansas. Beth Viola joins us. She is a senior policy advisor at Holland and Knight in the law firm's Washington, D.C. office. She helps lead the firm's energy and natural resources industry sector group, advises a range of corporate clients, coalitions, and industry associations on public policy related to greenhouse gas emissions reductions and the transition to a low carbon economy. Finally, Rob Werner joins us from the New Hampshire, as he's the New Hampshire State Director of the League of Conservation Voters. It's one of 30 state chapters for the League of Conservation Voters. And as they say on their website, we influence policy, hold politicians accountable, and win elections. This is how we fight to build a world with clean air, clean water, public lands, and a safe climate that are protected by a just and equitable democracy. Rob's also former National Field Director of Americans for Campaign Reform, and he served 7 terms on the Concord, New Hampshire City Council. Bless you for that. We always need good people serving in public life. So with that quick introduction, I would love to turn it over to each of you, maybe just say a little more, if as needed, about yourselves and your organizations. And then I want to start in your opening statements with 2 or 3, as you see it, 2 or 3 of the most important, overlooked, or misunderstood aspects of the Inflation Reduction Act. And please keep it high level. We will go deep into the weeds during the next hour, but I thought that might be a good way to kick it off. Dan, let me start with you.
Great. Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Peter, and the council for holding this event. As Peter noted, our organization, the New England Power Generator Association, represents a little over 90% of the installed generating capacity. And one step beyond that is it includes every different fuel and technology type to produce electricity in the region. And within that broad fuel mix and diversity across corporate types is a belief in an open, competitive market. And so taking that theme here as we look at the IRA, I think the fundamental component for us here in New England is this serves as a complementary piece now at the federal level to so much that's occurring already at the state level. As we see the further inducements and support for individual clean energy technologies, it can both accelerate the development that's already being mandated through some of the long-term contracts in places like Massachusetts, Connecticut, and others. And then also, I think, position us so that as we start looking at the next generation beyond this first wave of offshore wind, battery storage, solar, to start being able to create a financeable base within the wholesale market and open up competition to all the various developers and investment types that can come into this market. From that, we're also certainly on the supply side in the business of selling more megawatt hours, not less. And what we see here is also a dramatic acceleration of electrification and the expectation around electric vehicles, heat pumps, and looking for the first time in a serious manner at commercial fleets, which I think is going to be the component that probably has the most meaningful impact over the next several years on the electrification front. And then the final broad theme that I really want to bring out is that I think this is a unique opportunity of moving less towards things like the investment tax credit and the production tax credit, and more towards a direct pay and direct to consumer rebate type of program. And we're seeing this on the electric vehicle side, in which rather than having to have a lag time and wait for a tax reimbursement, which again also biases it towards those with tax exposure, more to being able to do point of sale types of transactions that my hope is will accelerate this. We also see that starting to emerge on the investment side on electric generation, things like 45Q and the reforms on that side that make it easier for companies that don't have large tax liabilities or need to then find a tax counterparty to sleeve that money through, to make it more of a direct pay model, again, opens this up to more competition, to more types of investors and corporate types that can then accelerate the investments overall. So I'll leave it there. Certainly a ton to unpack through all this.
Yeah, that's a fantastic appetizer for a rich meal ahead. Sheri Lauten from National Grid Ventures.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks for the earlier introduction as well. So for those whom I've not encountered, my name is Sheri Lauten. I'm the Director of Government Relations for National Grid Ventures, and I handle both federal and state engagement. Considering the crowd, I'll also add that I'm a native of Maine and have always felt very much amongst friends here at the New England Council. As one of the largest investor-owned energy companies in the world, National Grid really does play a vital role at the heart of a clean, fair, and affordable energy future. And National Grid has been embedded in communities in the northeastern US as a reliable energy provider for decades, and that's likely how you best know the company. National Grid Ventures is outside of that regulated business, and we have a diverse portfolio of flexible, low carbon, and renewable energy businesses across the US, Europe, and UK. And that includes subsea electricity interconnectors, transmission modernization, battery storage, wind and solar power, and we also operate generation plants in New York. We see ourselves as enablers and accelerators of the clean energy transition, like many of you on the call today. We're working toward delivering more solar, battery storage, and modernized transmission networks. And we're developing offshore wind as part of our community offshore wind joint venture with RWE Renewables. National Grid is also an MOU signatory for the Northeast Clean Hydrogen Hub effort that most of the New England states have also joined. National Grid believes in a future where clean energy hubs will populate the region and accelerate the clean energy that we need in order to really decarbonize. Our Northeast Clean Energy Vision is a model to develop and deliver a large-scale clean and fossil-free energy hub, and it contains 4 key components working together. Those are developing more clean and carbon-free energy from offshore wind and solar sources, using renewables to create clean hydrogen to fuel power plants and heat homes, bringing more battery storage online to store wind and solar energy for later use, and modernizing and expanding transmission networks to deliver a clean and carbon-free energy to customers and communities. So tackling climate change and reaching net zero is what drives National Grid's business, and that's why the IRA is so important. The clean energy tax incentives and the associated manufacturing tax incentives are vital to building out all of this infrastructure and these new industries. In terms of what's been overlooked or misunderstood, I would say the perception is that this legislation is a silver bullet, but really that's not the case. There's a lot more work to be done, and I know we'll dive into that a little later.
Great. Well said. Well, thank you very much, Sheri. Maggie Lemmerman from Ørsted, I would love to turn to you now to talk obviously about offshore wind, where you are a clear leader, but please feel free, any other aspects of the IRA that you think are really important to call out?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Peter. And thank you to the New England Council for having Ørsted on the panel today. For those who are familiar with us, Ørsted, we are a global clean energy leader. We are pioneering clean energy solutions sort of across the spectrum. You mentioned, Peter, of course, offshore wind, but we also have a lot of land-based wind, solar, and storage, as well as an increasingly robust green hydrogen program. We are proud to be the world's most sustainable energy company. And we also are really proud of this corporate transformation that we've made that we like to talk about quite a bit, which about 15 years ago, we were a traditional oil and gas company, and we have made this transition to becoming a pure play renewable energy company and expect to be entirely carbon neutral by 2025. Here in the US, we have around 600 employees, and we have 10 gigawatts of clean energy projects sort of across that technology space that I just mentioned, including 5 gigawatts of offshore wind projects that are in various stages of development, but are all under contract. When we look at New England, we have our offshore wind headquarters in Boston and another major office in Providence. And of our offshore wind portfolio, we have 3 projects that are being developed in New England waters. Those are South Fork Wind, Sunrise Wind, and Revolution Wind. So really proud of the presence that we've established in New England. 2 of the key themes I'll just mention quickly as far as Ørsted's offshore wind business here in the US, because I think they are relevant when we get into the IRA discussion, is that first, Ørsted has placed a huge emphasis on building out our domestic supply chain. We can now count 41 states that provide part of the sort of manufacturing and supply chain contributions to our offshore wind program. And this is sort of even before we've put steel in the water, we're really kind of building out this robust network of American supply chain. Also, I'll mention that we have really leaned in heavily to coordinating and cooperating with organized labor. This really culminated in the signing of what we call the National Offshore Wind Agreement, which we signed earlier this year with the North American Building Trades Union. And this is a commitment to build all of our offshore wind projects, all of the offshore construction work to be done using union labor. So we're really proud of that accomplishment. And frankly, we really see our sort of embrace and coordination with organized labor as a competitive advantage as we, look to train and figure out the skill sets and find the workforce that we're going to need for this new American industry. So as we kind of get into the meat of the discussion today and sort of look at the IRA provisions, maybe a couple of kind of overarching pieces I'll just mention up front that Ørsted is really kind of focused on and want to bring some attention to in today's conversation. The first, and this is not specific to any one piece in the legislation, but I will flag that sort of the longevity and the certainty that the overall clean energy tax package brings is just hugely valuable. As I said, Ørsted, we are a multi-technology company, and having tax credits now that sort of span the spectrum of clean energy options allows us to think more holistically about different integrated technology solutions. So whether that's solar plus storage or offshore wind and green hydrogen, we can sort of create these products that our customers want. So I think that's just a really incredible and exciting opportunity. I'll also mention specific to kind of the tax credits and some of the new pieces that we frankly are still digesting a bit in the IRA. There was the creation of what's called the domestic content bonus credit, where essentially a taxpayer can claim an additional 10% credit if your energy facility meets certain domestic content requirements. As I mentioned, Ørsted is heavily investing in domestic content and in building out a supply chain. So we're really eager to ensure that this is a tax credit that we can tap into and really utilize, and that it will spur additional supply chain investment in the US. So that's one we're paying particular attention to and engaging with Treasury on. And then finally, I'll just mention as well that, I think there's a lot of excitement and interest in the new hydrogen tax credits, certainly for a company like Ørsted that is building out our US hydrogen business. But what I think is really unique and interesting and worth exploring is that it's also, I think, forced our friends in the EU and policymakers in Europe to sort of be thinking about how do they maybe try to regain the competitive advantage that they had on green hydrogen. There's now a lot of excitement in the US market that is really going to spur a lot of investment here, which is obviously a great thing. But I think we've now created this kind of competitive virtuous cycle where the EU is sort of rethinking how do they further incentivize green hydrogen and try to get ahead in this new market opportunity. So that's really exciting to see. But I will pause there and look forward to the discussion.
Great. Virtuous competition with Europe. Beth Viola, Senior Policy Advisor with Holland & Knight in Washington. I feel like you bring this great multi-industry, multi-jurisdiction perspective to Inflation Reduction Act. So we'd love to put the question to you on important, overlooked, or misunderstood aspects of the IRA as you see it.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure. This Brockton girl who ended up in the Clinton White House, spending most of her time working for Al Gore, has spent her whole career getting up every day thinking, how do we get CO2 out of the atmosphere and make a transition to a low carbon economy? So I'm super excited about this conversation and really about what lies ahead as a result of the Inflation Reduction Act. As was said, just as quick background, I am with Holland & Knight, which is a large international law firm, but we do have one of the largest policy shops in Washington, D.C., and we bring together a bipartisan group of folks that are very committed to trying to help meet our clients' objectives as we do move into this sort of new energy economy. I am, as I said, I'm really excited about the Inflation Reduction Act. I think it's important to remember, like, to take a little bit of a step back, that then candidate Biden ran on an agenda that said we were going to build and strengthen our nation's economy. We were going to do it in a way that created good paying jobs, and we were going to do it in a way that created, that reduced emissions. And I think if you look at this president's success rate, and it's not a commercial for the Biden administration as much as it is, if you look at what's happened in the last almost 2 years, you've got the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, now the Inflation Reduction Act, and of course the CHIPS Act, which are all intended to do all of the things that the president talked about and to onshore our manufacturing here in the United States. I think the pieces about the IRA that are really exciting for me, in addition to those that are super obvious, is that it also does, I think Maggie alluded to this, is it really does create some certainty. For the first time, industry who has been complaining, like, we need certainty. And if you look at things, for example, like the tax credits, this every 2 years trying to deal with an extenders package, for the first time, you have a 10-year runway. So industry has the opportunity to really plan and think about what they're going to do and put some steel in the ground. And the same for the direct spending. In some instances, we have 5 years of direct spending from the federal agencies. And again, unprecedented amounts of money to really try to help move the needle. So I think all of those things combined are really great. And then, you add to that all of the pieces. And again, Maggie mentioned some of these, but some of the incentives that were baked into things like the tax credits, or that are going to be part of the way the funding goes out the door from the agencies, is really important. Looking at prevailing wage, looking at domestic content, you see these themes throughout all of these bills and the way the administration is going to put money out the door in terms of direct spending. So it's a really great time to be working in these issues, as somebody who's been waiting for the moment for us to actually try to make this transition to a low carbon economy. I think it's a great moment. And as I get ready to head to Egypt to the UN climate meeting, I think for the first time in a long time, the United States gets to say they're going to put their money where their mouth is. So it's going to be an interesting COP this year.
Great. Thank you, Beth. And great to have somebody from the City of Champions represented. And Rob, let's turn it to you for your perspective from League of Conservation Voters.
Thanks. So glad to be here. So I think, as many of you know, LCV is a long-standing, very active participant in policy and political work. We've been around for 51 years, and we have a very robust group of organizations in New England. We've been working on this and advocating for this for decades, and mobilizing our members and working with members of Congress and business people and all sorts of leaders of various sectors of the world and community. And I think it's taken a lot of effort. And there was a period of time where, frankly, we didn't think it was going to happen. I think we had somewhat given up a little bit in terms of, it's just this political situation which we find ourselves with, such a closely divided Congress. It's just not going to happen. Although I will say that the infrastructure bill certainly has a lot of very good things in it that have much to recommend in terms of clean energy infrastructure. But this really is a big deal. And as Beth said, I will also be around COP. I will also be heading to Egypt in a couple of weeks. And, it really enhances the credibility of the United States. A couple of the things that really will be out of focus on this particular COP are loss and damage, in terms of, how is the developed world going to help the third world or southern world deal more with climate change impacts. The other thing is really increasing ambition. In Glasgow last year, it was really made clear that this COP in Egypt is an opportunity for increase our ambition, which we really need to do all around the globe. And again, the credibility that we have gained by passing legislation and not having executive orders, which, at the time was a positive thing, but they do not have the longevity and certainty of legislation. So that's really important. I'd say one of the aspects of the IRA that maybe doesn't get a lot of attention is the agricultural provisions, because agriculture production is a significant contributor to emissions. And to the extent that farmers and the agricultural community can really be part of the solution here, this legislation enhances that greatly in terms of helping farmers transition their crops to climate-friendly production. It helps them develop solar and other renewable energies on their land, so which can really coexist with agricultural production. So that's something I think that people can really pay attention to. And I think it will help small farmers in our New England region be part of the solution. The other aspect is the individual sort of provisions, the homeowner, the property owner. What can I do? What does this mean to me? And I think that, you know, the provisions of tax credits with heat pumps and energy efficiency measures and all those kinds of things, building, you know, energy efficiency in our buildings, not only commercial, but residential, can really make a big impact. And I think it's incumbent upon a lot of us to really make sure that folks understand how to access all of these programs. It's going to be a big job to do that, but I think it's a very important. And the last thing I'll say is that no matter what kind of ambitious goals are set, whether they're international, national, state, it really comes down to implementation on the local level. You know, as Peter mentioned, I served on the city council in Concord for a number of years. I still chair our energy committee for the city. And really, that's where the action is going to take place in so many ways, in terms of taking all of these opportunities and how is it implemented at the local level.
Great. Well, thank you, Rob. And your point about farms, go to Iowa, it looks like the three crops are soybeans, corn, and wind turbines all growing together out there, which is extraordinary to see. There are, as you all have alluded to, 12 different flavors of tax credits in this legislation. And one of the most important things that's going to happen in coming months is the Treasury Department beginning to flesh out the details. And I know this can get into the weeds super quickly, but I do think your point, Rob, about implementation is so important. We'd love to put it to the panel as Secretary Yellen's team is fleshing out the actual regulations on how these various tax credits will work. What do you consider to be some of the most important provisions? Maggie, maybe we should start with you on that.
Yeah, sure. So I sort of alluded to this in my opening comments, but for Ørsted, I would say sort of top of mind is the domestic content bonus credit. So this is one where certainly it's clear that Congress's intent was that let's create an incentive where companies can be motivated to increasingly bring more and more domestic content into their clean energy projects, whether that's a wind farm or a solar farm or storage, whatever the case might be. But what was sort of left to Treasury to decide is how do you define domestic content and sort of what is the scope of a renewable energy project, and sort of what can you count towards domestic content? Is it just the manufacturing pieces, or is it the labor that goes into the project? Is it the sort of construction activity that goes into the project? And so those questions are left to Treasury to put out guidance around. And we're certainly engaged in that process. So there was a notice that was put out by Treasury. I'm sure many folks are aware of this who are joining the call today, but essentially looking for public comment on 6 different pieces of the legislation, including this domestic content credit, along with a number of others. And that feedback is due the end of next week. So I think a lot of folks are really kind of rapidly trying to make their case for different elements of this. But so we're very much engaged there. And again, I think for us it really goes back to trying to ensure that the guidance that Treasury puts out is consistent with the intent of Congress to really motivate companies to continue to invest in the domestic supply chain And quite frankly, our pitch as Orsted is that, look, we've already been doing quite a bit of this, and we really would like to ensure that as it's written, companies like Orsted that are sort of leaning into this are able to access that credit so that it continues to motivate us to invest in the domestic supply chain. So we're really quite focused on that.
Great. Other thoughts about things people very much hope Treasury will get right?
So I'll jump in on this one. Some of the provisions include looking at places where there were former coal plants, for instance, or mining facilities that were closed, and bringing clean energy to those areas. And there are a lot of questions that remain around exactly how those areas will be defined over time. For instance, if they're based on census tracts, the census tracts change every 10 years. Which definition do you go on? What happens if the tract shifts over time? How does it qualify at the beginning or at the end? And so the mechanics of how all of these tax incentives are going to work is really what Treasury is looking at now, and needs to provide an additional level of certainty to the industry so that projects can be designed accordingly.
Great. So we obviously have a election coming up on November 8th, which feels very uncertain, to me at least, in terms of the range of ways that it plays out. I'd love to put it to all of you. How concerned or not are you about the fate of the IRA if we have a Republican House and/or Senate starting in January?
I'll jump in.
Given this past
Sure.
with no Republican
Jump in there.
support,
Yeah.
does it potentially get undercut or repealed?
Well, I think certainly not original thought, but I think it's pretty likely that there'll be a Republican majority in the House. The Senate, much less certain, obviously. It's on a razor's edge. But I think that what we're looking at, particularly if the Democrats retain control of the Senate, is a lot of gridlock, because certain folks who want to do things opposite of what the administration has been doing will certainly have an opportunity to make the case, and in some cases pass legislation. But you do have a president of the United States who would veto much of what would be different from what he wants to do. And you're not going to have the adequate majorities in Congress to override vetoes. So depending on particularly on what happens in the Senate, I see a lot of gridlock in the next 2 years. So I'm not particularly worried about the IRA in that aspect. But I would hope that the benefits of the IRA and these large investments that will spur even greater private sector investment in all of these areas, whether it's energy efficiency, EV development, deployment, offshore wind obviously is a huge opportunity. It's going to benefit our region and create a lot of jobs. I'm hopeful that over a period of time that folks who maybe were skeptical or really didn't understand, well, what does this mean to me? How does it affect me? Why should I care about it? We'll come to see that these investments are wise investments, that they have leveraged benefits for folks that they can really see. And I do expect that will happen. And I hope that our political system and hopefully society would respond by being, providing more support over the long term for these programs, because we need to do this for an environmental basis, and we can confront the climate crisis in a way that's going to create economic opportunity for communities and a great number of jobs for our citizens.
Beth, I saw you had thoughts.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I agree pretty much with everything Rob just said. The challenge we have is this is a major reconciliation bill. So it was obviously done along Democratic Party lines, and it's not unlike what we saw with the Affordable Care Act back at the beginning of the Obama administration, right? So we're going to see a new Congress come in, and they're just going to take out the long knives towards the IRA. And I think while it's going to be incredibly hard, given what we anticipate in terms of a very tight, divide in the Senate, for anything of any major consequence to happen to the IRA. But I do think it's important to know that the House of Representatives in particular will probably spend a fair amount of time doing oversight of this legislation, which means that they are going to try to tie the hands of the federal government, of the Biden administration, and get them spending a lot of time responding to things as opposed to them using their resources to put money out the door. And so I think that's going to be a challenge. And unfortunately, it's just going to be a lot of white noise, but it is going to create some challenges for an administration that is currently already struggling to try to get bodies in place to help implement all of these big pieces of legislation, in particular, the bipartisan legislation and the infrastructure and the IRA.
Right.
Peter, if I could add one thing that is potentially a countervailing force on some of this, and it's the fact that there is so much an enhancement to the manufacturing base, and many of those manufacturing bases are going to be in predominantly red districts. And so while I think there's going to be, I think Beth is spot on, there's going to be a tremendous amount of oversight on the implementation of a lot of these programs, particularly the incentives around clean energy. I think there is going to be a holdback on a full-scale repeal or undermining of the entire package, because there's going to be, I think, tremendous amount of interest among many Republicans on trying to support and get their districts front in line to be able to take advantage of some of the manufacturing pieces. And so I think that's going to create just enough of a friction point and a conflict internally in the caucus that you may see the attention focused more on that oversight piece that Beth put her finger on, and less around a full repeal and replace type of a construct.
Right. Question I'd love to put to everybody is New England competing for and winning at least its share of the jobs that come along with the IRA. I've seen estimates of 1.5 million jobs by 2030 if this all plays out as it could and should. What do we do in our region to make sure that we are getting at least our fair share of manufacturing and other renewable energy jobs? Are there things that leap out at you as important for governors and state legislatures and state economic development authorities to be focusing on here in our 6 states?
Well, I would say that the region as a whole is very well positioned because of all the work that's been done on the state level in most of our states. Now, of course, New Hampshire is a bit of a stepchild in this regard in terms of what we have done on the state level. But, given all the goals and legislation that have been passed in Massachusetts, particularly recently, and most of the other New England states in terms of the ambitious goals they have, and the ways that they're going to need to utilize the IRA and other programs and other resources to meet those goals, and how the private sector is going to work with the public sector to do that, I'm very optimistic that we will get more than our fair share of economic opportunity and jobs. Now, speaking just a minute about New Hampshire, we do have, you referenced that we have an election coming up, and we are hopeful that we have, as a result of that election, some policymakers that would look more favorably, perhaps. I'd like to say that, to be kind in some ways, that our policymakers in New Hampshire lack imagination compared to our neighbors, but we need to change that. But I would say overall as a region, we are in a very good place.
Maggie, I was curious, as you were talking about the 10% credit for domestic content. One of the questions that immediately raised for me is that enough? Is that enough to make the difference when you're competing with China, competing with a global supply chain? Maybe a question for you and Sheri, as speaking for organizations that operate globally.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think in short, yes, it is a very appealing credit that really does inject a level of competitiveness and support to our projects that is frankly very welcome, especially right now at this time of high inflation and high interest rates that are presenting challenges, I'm sure not just to offshore wind projects, but sort of any large infrastructure project has suddenly become much more expensive to build in the last year. So having a 10% credit, is hugely meaningful. So I would certainly say it is enough. But to your kind of larger question around sort of, competing with China and other markets, I think that is why, the IRA is so important, that we now have this market signal that says the US is open for business, and not just for 1 year or 2 years of tax credits, but for a full 10 years plus, sort of, based on kind of how the language is written, because we do have a lot of global companies like Ørsted that are building projects, in Europe, in the UK, in Asia Pacific, and we have choices to make when it comes to where we are going to deploy our capital. And so realizing that, the US is now this sort of stable, welcome place to make clean energy investments, I think is a huge advantage for the US economy. And we'll begin to see dividends in that very quickly.
Right. Sheri, at least on my screen, it looks like you may have video issues, but I'm wondering if you're fully connected audio wise. I just want to make sure we give you a chance to weigh in.
I'm not sure if others can see me. I can see myself on Zoom, but I can hear everything going on as well. So I would echo everything that Maggie just said, and also say that it probably depends on a component by component basis whether there's true parity with the 10% tax credit and what you could find in the global market. But what that 10% doesn't really capture is what you're saving in terms of reduction in risk. So we've seen a lot of supply chain challenges in the last few years because of disruptions from COVID, because of labor practices in some parts of the world. And so being able to bring industry into the US so that when we're looking for a component, it is available domestically, is a game changer in terms of where we source.
Excellent. We have about 18 minutes, and I do want to encourage people to pop questions for the panel into the Q&A box. We obviously have, our tone so far has been pretty celebratory and optimistic and excited, but I'm going to go there and let's talk about some things that aren't in this bill that maybe should have been or need to be in future follow-up legislation. And I'm thinking in particular of the transmission challenge. Does the IRA do enough around what we're going to have to invest in to get these gigawatts and gigawatts of offshore wind into our New England power grid and hydropower down from Quebec and elsewhere? Are there things you would point to as if we're doing a round 2 of Inflation Reduction Act, what should go into it?
So we're certainly watching what's happening in the Senate, or sometimes not happening in the Senate, with regard to permitting reform, because all of these major infrastructure projects have very long timelines for being built, and the majority of that time is spent on navigating the permitting process at the federal and the state level. So in terms of what New England states can do to help ensure that all of this investment is going to come to New England, is making sure that there's a very clear timeline, very clear process, and that the rules aren't changing along the way, because that's going to make investors and developers look elsewhere. So at the federal level, ensuring agencies have the resources they need to conduct all of these permitting reviews will be really important. They're going to need to staff up to handle the demand, but also just making sure that in every step of the process, there's the same level of certainty that has now been provided by this much longer duration tax incentive window.
Mm-hmm.
I'll jump in to completely echo everything Sheri just said on the importance of getting some permitting reforms in place. I'll also mention, one thing we haven't talked too much about. I know we've been mentioning sort of the manufacturing elements of the bill, but specifically there are credits in the bill for directly for manufacturers of clean energy equipment. However, in the offshore wind space, it's a fairly limited set of manufacturers that can qualify. And we worked with Senator Markey actually on legislation last year that covers a more expansive set of manufacturing tax credits for offshore wind. So it includes things like offshore wind substations that we can build in the US, offshore wind cables, even steel for offshore wind, that we would love to see sort of added at some point down the road as tax credits that for offshore wind manufacturers. We just think that would be a more holistic kind of way to incentivize the full breadth of the supply chain. So I'll put a note there for our support for something like that.
Beth or Rob, as our policy experts, thoughts about missing pieces that need to be filled in to really make the IRA fully succeed?
Well, I would go back to the local action. So this package gets us to about 40% reduction in carbon emissions over the term. But we know that the targets that states and municipalities and others have been working on are more ambitious than that. They need to be. So this is really where local action is going to sort of fill that gap or sort of close that last gap. And what I mean by that is to the extent of communities being able to change their zoning to allow the wider development of renewable energy within their communities. How are they going to transition their transportation fleets, starting with municipalities? We know we have to electrify everything. And that is going to require a lot of infrastructure to be put on the ground in the local level. And that's where I really think local leadership, cities and towns, other municipal players in general, are going to have to play a very large role. And certainly transmission in terms of our entire grid and making sure that our New England grid is enhanced and ready to take all of this new load. And again, as we are electrifying everything, we have to make sure that our grid is modernized. And obviously there are resources that are being put towards that. And you have New England states banding together for a transmission initiative. I think it's really important. But that's going to take a lot of work and paying attention to making certain that things are working around the region and adjusting when we have to.
I would say the one thing that I think is really missing from this package, I think there's some more work that can be done on the RD&D side. That could probably be some funding that could happen there. But I think the biggest issue really is going to be the permitting, and do some sort of permitting reform in a way that makes sense, that still does everything to protect the environment, create transparency, but really streamlines the process in a way that allows us to actually get steel in the ground. I mean, we've got unprecedented amounts of money. And so it would be really heartbreaking to see us not be able to actually deploy those resources because of permitting delays. And I'll say this is one area where I do think, there is some bipartisan interest in trying to do something on permitting reform. And while politics kind of crept in and created a messy situation for trying to get Manchin's approach done here before the election, and I still think it'll be hard before the end of this year, I do think this is something that we may see tacked on next year in a bipartisan way.
We'll get to a couple questions from the audience, but the last one from me is, as you look at the Inflation Reduction Act, do you feel like there are some precedents out there to say, this will play out in a way similar to the way another type of legislation did earlier, and we can kind of predict what's going to come of it? Or do you look at this and say, this is really extraordinary? This is unprecedented. This whole, as Dan alluded to, this whole shift from tax credits to immediate rebates, with incredible implications for who can afford to take advantage of it. Long way of asking, do you feel like there's some precedents you can point to for how we can expect to see IRA play out, or are we in somewhat uncharted territory?
I'll just say it again. I mean, I think the clearest easiest comparison is the Affordable Care Act, right? Also done under reconciliation. So which means that there does not have to be a ton of specific direction to the agency. It leaves an awful lot to the Treasury Department, for example, to an IRS to implement. There are places in the IRA that are incredibly specific on tax incentives, like the 30D car purchase, consumer credit. But on the other hand, there are places where we don't have a lot of clarity on things like domestic content, right? So I think it's going to be very similar to that in terms of the way it gets implemented, but I think also in terms of the attacks that it receives. So I think it's just going to continue to be a punching bag as the administration moves forward to try to implement it.
Yeah, I would, I think you're right about that, at least in the shorter term. But as we've talked about before, perhaps the benefits as they flow to a wide range of society is then going to create a situation where people say, you know, I'm really glad we did that. Because any large change like this is going to create division, particularly the way it was done. But I see little choice politically of having, you know, doing it that way, certainly support doing it that way under reconciliation, because the stakes are so high. But I also think it's really important from an implementation point of view that these programs are implemented well, that they develop political and public support, that the benefits are discernible and flow to people, because I think that's going to make a political and policy difference and an acceptance in larger society that this was a really positive thing to do. It created jobs, it put us in a much better situation and helped our environment. And perhaps it'll leverage a situation where this is the start, because frankly, this is a great thing, but we have to do a lot more to get to where we need to go in terms of climate change impacts and meeting that challenge. So that's my hope for it.
Excellent. We have a great question from Paul Joy in the Q&A, and I'll just read it verbatim. Massachusetts is heavily reliant on natural gas for electricity generation compared with other sources, hydro and nuclear. Does the IRA, he asks, combined with higher gas prices and increased volatility, speed Massachusetts' transition towards wind, solar, and other increasingly competitive energy generation assets? What's the worst, middle, and best case scenarios look like in 2030? And I think you can sort of substitute all of New England for Massachusetts in the question. You know, how do you see what's happening with global prices and supplies of natural gas playing into the impact that the IRA has in how quickly we move towards net zero, where we are in 2030?
I'll take a crack at that. So certainly, as you look at it from a purely economic standpoint, when you see higher cost alternatives, and as the question noted, the extreme volatility we've seen on natural gas pricing recently, and then on the other side, further direct support for alternative sources across the board on the clean energy side, it has to create an inducement and an acceleration on that side. However, as has been talked about here, the biggest impediment across the board in New England is siting. And now coupled with the challenging financing environment that is being seen with higher interest rates, supply chain slowdowns affecting the entire spectrum of energy sources, everything from offshore wind to natural gas to fuel oil to battery storage, the key components and the financing is challenging. All that being said, we've done this before. This is not the first time that we are in a 7, 8, 9% interest rate environment in which we're dealing with challenging supply chains and difficult siting issues that have always existed in a place like New England. So I still remain optimistic that we're going to get this done and be able to continue to move forward. 2030 is around the corner. And in terms of what are the best and worst case scenarios around that, you know, my crystal ball is awfully cracked and cloudy, but I do think we're going to see some incremental growth and support but it is probably going to be more delayed than what we see in some of the mandates under existing state statutes. But fundamentally, yes, this supports further investment and growth into clean energy sources.
Great. Also, a good question from Tom McShane pointing out Avangrid putting a pause on Commonwealth wind. We've seen a couple of the Massachusetts projects schedules slip a bit. And his question is, should we worry that offshore wind may not be as robust a promising horizon as we thought? And are there other things we haven't yet talked about in the IRA that could help keep offshore wind pressing ahead rapidly? I don't want to totally put you on the spot, Maggie, but I do feel like it's a good question for you, given where you work.
Yeah, I'll try. I mean, obviously, I can't speak to the reasons that Commonwealth Wind made that announcement. But as I said before, I mean, there are some serious macroeconomic challenges that offshore wind projects are facing right now. Not the least of which is high inflation and high interest rates. I hate to keep coming back to it, but yes, that 10% domestic content bonus would make a meaningful impact on the sort of health of the New England offshore wind projects that are under development right now. Another piece that is in the IRA is a significant increase in funding for some of the permitting agencies. So most relevant to offshore wind is BOEM, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, who is the lead permitting agency for offshore wind projects, but also for NOAA and NIMS, which play a really important supporting role in permitting these projects. We know they are under increasing pressure given the number of offshore wind projects that are now going through the environmental review process. So I think enhancing the resource that those agencies have is of course critical so that they can, hopefully kind of keep pace with the timelines of project reviews. But I think, coming back to another point that's been raised a few times is if we can have some additional permitting reform that can complement both the increase in funding for those agencies and also complement these tax credits, I think that will go a long way to bring some timeline certainty to these projects, because that is really at the root cause of a lot of the challenges and the cost implications that we're seeing is incremental delays, even a month or two, can have serious long-term impacts in the cost of these projects. And so the more we can do to sort of bring additional sort of certainty and streamlining to the permitting process, I think that will significantly help the business cases.
Great. Well, it's we're getting very close to noon. Mr. Brett is a stickler about getting his guests out on time. So the one last thing I want to put out to the group, as people are looking for additional information, clarity, insight into what's in the IRA, any resources that you found especially useful that you would commend to our audience?
Well, I expect this to drop today, if not today, then early next week. But I have been talking with the Climate Mayors Group, and they indicate that they're working on a compendium of IRA provisions for local officials, mayors, and other folks that are involved in municipal operations, which I also think will be accessible to the general public. They promised me that it will be in terms of how to explain how all this works, how's the funding work, to the extent that we know. Obviously, things are still being worked on, but these kinds of guides that organizations put together, I think, are going to be really useful. So I'll be looking for that today, if not early next week, and we'll certainly make that available to folks.
Excellent.
I would just say too, we have a Holland Tonight on its website has a great guide for local governments to turn in terms of trying to take advantage of money, in addition to a 44-page guide that I walk around with every single day of my life, which is a good summary of the IRA, but a good breakdown of everything. And I think it's just a handy resource.
Also available on your Holland Tonight website?
Correct.
Great. Excellent. Terrific. Well, on behalf of Jim Brett and Emily Heisig and Sean Malone from New England Council, I want to thank you all so much for sharing your time and your wisdom and your insights. I want to thank everybody who, all our attendees who joined us today, and Rob Werner, Beth Viola, Sheri Lauten, Maggie Lemmerman, Dan Dolan. You've been an excellent panel, and wish you much success with your endeavors going forward. And again, thanks so much for making time to chat with us today. And thank everybody for your support and engagement with the New England Council.
It's great to be with you all. Have a good day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Peter. Bye all.